Good evening, everyone. We are now towards the end of the book of Zechariah. We have arrived in Zechariah chapter 13, which we are doing today. This is a short chapter, and there are a number of instances where the translation in the English has given us a lot of difficulty because it is not quite accurate. So let's begin with chapter 13. Again, I like to remind all of us that as we read these words of prophecy that is revealed to Zechariah and in regards to the that day and those days and the end days. Now all of this refer to a time period where it is sometime in the future, and it describes a lot of things not directly. What do I mean by that? The language that is being used in the book of Zechariah is largely prophetic, and it is also largely poetic. So let me just put it down so that we remember. They are prophetic, it's about the future. They are also written in a poetic language, which refers to a lot of imagery and not didactic. And these would be instructional, direct instructions. So the language of Zechariah is poetic in nature, prophetic of the future. And it begins this on that day, that sometime in the future, it says a fountain will be open for the house of David and for the inhabitants of Jerusalem, which we saw in chapter 12. House of David, Beit David, and those who dwell in Jerusalem. And it says here, for sin and for defilement. Now, allow me to make some corrections to the translation. The first one here is this word, makor. This refers to, and let me just draw a picture. It's not quite a fountain. It's referring to a place where there is uh, on the ground, where somewhere far deep inside you find what a fountain. I guess you can call it a fountain. It pushes the water up, and this is a makor, which is translated normally as a well. Now, this is not really a well that is dug up, but it gives that impression that there's a boring, there's a hole that's down deep inside, and the water is gushing out. And hence, you see that certain translators will translate this as a well, but it is actually water underneath that is being pushed up from a hole, and it is there open up for the purpose of the house of David and for the inhabitants of Jerusalem, which also tells us that this would be in their vicinity. And this is pure water, clean water. And it has a purpose, and this purpose has to be well understood so that we will understand chapter 13, because this is the summary of chapter 13. That there is for sin and for defilement. I think we should just take these words off because that's not how it should be translated. It should be translated as uh, for purification uh, and for well, yeah, for purification and for cleansing of uncleanness. That would be a much better way to express. The water from the fountain is being depicted as to be used for the purification and the cleansing of the unrighteousness or the uncleanness of the house of David and of the inhabitants of Jerusalem. The entire chapter then describes exactly what God is going to do with regards to purification and cleansing. And this would be the theme of chapter 13. And so, with chapter 13, verse 1, it sets us up for a better understanding of the rest of the chapter. Remember, we are still looking at things of the future, and much of the language is poetic, it is not didactic. And it says here, and it will come about on that day, the future day, declares God, right? Jehovah Tzevaot, that I will eliminate the names of the idols from the land, and they will no longer be remembered. And I will also remove the prophets and the unclean spirit from the land. Again, I need to translate some of these words a bit clearer. So the first thing is I will eliminate. It's a good word. And this idea here is God will cause to perish. Cause to perish. So eliminate is a good word. And it says the names of the idols from the land. Remember, this is poetic. So these are idols or images, right? Idols or images. And these are the ones that displeases God. And so God is going to purify the land of all idols. The second thing that God wants to say is they will no longer be remembered, means that would be the end. It's not going to be around and nobody's going to talk about them anymore. That's in the future. And it says here, I will also remove the prophets. And these are the, well, I guess we could say the false prophets. And God is indicating to us that even in the future, as time comes, there will not be any prophets. And all those who claim to be prophets are false prophets. And so we want to be clear of what the text is actually saying in the poetic language. Now, the last one here says, the spirit of uncleanness or the spirit of impurity. I guess we call it impurity. And we could say that this would be um, religious impurity. I think that's quite okay to express it in those terms. That would be religious impurity. These would be the evil inclinations that goes against God. And so this idea that we are reading here in a poetic language is that all the well, I guess you can say undue evil influences that goes against God, right? That goes against God. They will all be removed. Now, the word removed here, I think we can say that it will be caused, right? Caused to, let's see, we can say it will be caused to pass away, caused to pass away, which means that this would be over a period of time, they will just disappear. Now, that would be a better way of understanding verse 2. So these will be the cleansing. So remember, this chapter is about cleansing. And that's what we are reading starting from verse 2. Verse 3. And if anyone still prophesies, and this refers to false prophecies, it appears that in those days there will be no more prophecies. Then his father and mother who gave birth to him, the birth parents, will say to him, "You shall not live," which means, in other words, you shall die. And this is serious because they are accusing him of this, spoken falsely in the name of the Lord. Spoken falsely in the name of the Lord is tantamount to blasphemy. And this is death by punishment. And essentially, you'll find that the false prophets are the ones who are putting words into God's mouth, right? Putting words into God's mouth. And this is really a serious and grievous charge. Remember, we're talking about cleansing of the prophets now. And his father and mother who gave birth to him shall pierce him through when he prophesies. And this would be falsely. So false prophets or prophets would not appear in those days, but there will be people who pretend to speak on behalf of God. And this idea of pierce him through is to thrust through. Or you can use the word stab. And that's the form of execution for false prophet in the days to come. And so how would you know anyone who claims to be a prophet appears to be a false prophet? Because there will be no more prophets at that time. Now, verse 4, and it will also come about on that day that these prophets, the false prophets, will each be ashamed of his vision. Now, this idea of vision is from what he can see in a supernatural way. That is the meaning of the word. But because it is a false prophet, he would have false vision. And so when he prophesies, people would not believe in him because in those days, prophets tend to put on a robe. And this gives a more, how should you say, a more authentic appearance. So when people put on the robe, it shows that the prophet actually is speaking prophecies of God. But we are reading here that in those days, these false prophets, they will not put on such a robe to deceive. They will just speak of it and they will be ashamed. They will be put to shame. They will be disappointed because they are giving false prophecies. Now, this is poetic language and is describing some time in the future. As the time draws on where prophets will eventually disappear, then it says he will say, "I am not a prophet." They will then start to disclaim that I am a farmer. I am a cultivator of the ground because a man sold me in my youth. So false prophets are disappearing. And this is the what we call a graphical and poetic way of describing the disappearance of prophets. And someone will say to him, What are these wounds between your arms? Now, this idea of wounds, uh, they are stripes or slashes, and they try to depict that they are spiritual. They cut themselves as if that they have some powers of seeing the future words, but they are all false. And they had tried to do this to impress upon the people, hence false prophecies. And so people will ask them, what are these wounds, these slashes between your hands? Right? Between your hands. And then he will say, well, I was wounded at the house of my friends. And they would give the excuse that they are just done by accident and not because they were false prophets. Because the days of false prophets in those days, in that day in the future, will be bad. And so the land will be cleansed of false prophets as well. So there will be idols that will be cleansed. The names will no longer be remembered. There will be false prophets to be cleansed. We have in verse 7 comes an expression, a statement from God. And in some ways, it's not as easy to understand, but let's try. It says here, uh, awake, and this would be aroused. Be aroused. Arousing what? The sword, the knife. Remember, this is a poetic language. And so this is not speaking about people, but it's speaking in metaphorical ways. Arise or be aroused, the sword, against my shepherd. And in this case, it would be king, the king that God had entrusted Israel for safekeeping. And then it says here, and against the man, and this is not the man, my associate. And this should be understood as my colleague, or my neighbor, my friend, my warrior friend, my warrior friend, my warrior colleague. And this would be the kings, right? The kings and rulers that God had also entrusted for safekeeping. And what this would mean is that there will be the day where Israel is not their own. Israel is under foreign rule, which has started since Babylon, or if you want a bit earlier, would be the Assyrians. But Babylon is a good way of looking at it, because even though they came back to the land, until today, they are not really under a king. They are under different rule. And today, they are not a kingdom by themselves. And so Israel has to work with other people. And so this is a picture that God had entrusted Israel to other kings and other colleagues, that there will be friends of Israel, declares the Lord of armies. And by saying, awake, sword against my shepherd, that would be saying that God is pronouncing punishment against the king and or the shepherd and the warrior friends. Okay, the warrior friends. And God wants to punish them for mistreating Israel in that day. And when that happens, the phrase is, Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered, and I will turn my hand against the little ones. Now, we need a little bit more of uh, translation here, right? The translation should read this way. Strike the shepherd. The word strike is hug. And it's not really strike, it is to stab or to thrust. And so this is about using the knife or the sword, right? It is not to strike and like chopping things, but when you use a sword or a knife, the way of attack would be to stab. And so it's to stab this shepherd, this one here, and then the sheep. Now, oftentimes, this word sheep does mean Israel. Israel will be scattered. Now, the idea of Israel will be scattered should be said, let, let me just rephrase this. Let the flock scatter. That would be a better way of saying it, right? And so strike or thrust or stab the shepherd, let the flock scatter, and they will be escaping for their lives, so that they will be released from the stranglehold of the shepherd and the friends, warriors. And God says, I will turn my hand against these insignificant ones. Now, the little ones means the insignificant ones, which would be these friends of Israel, who is actually sitting and influencing and governing Israel. We come to the final two verses, and it says this in verse 8, and it will come about in all the land, declares the Lord. And this might be a bit difficult to understand because the imagery that is painting is that there's a lot of destruction. God had already said that he will purify the land. First the idols, then the prophets, then all these shepherds, kings, the leaders who are foreign to Israel, who were friendly but no longer and mistreat Israel, and that the flock will scatter, will run away. And those who are still in the land, and God is saying this, very difficult words to appreciate. Two parts in it will be cut off and perish. And so it says, two portions, right? Two portions of those who are in the land will be cut off. Now, cut off is to terminate. And then perish means to breathe last breath, if you want to call it that way. So there will be destruction, but the third will be left in it that appears to be remnants. Now, if this would be the rest of Israel who were there will be very few who will be at the end of this period standing. And so this is difficult words to say because perhaps it might say that many of these are going to be killed by the kings in Gog and Magog, right? In the days of Gog and Magog. And this would be Ezekiel chapters 38 to 39. But in chapters 38 and 39 did not indicate who dies. But in chapter 13, verse 8 in Zechariah, It alludes to the fact that 2/3 of the people in the land, which is Israel, will die, and only a third will be left in the land. In verse 9, it tells us this: and I will bring the third part through the fire. Now, as a metaphorical or an imagery, this is really fire. But fire does one of two things: consume and purify. And as we saw in verse 1, this chapter is about purification. And so we see fire in verse 9 as purification. That God will refine them as silver is refined and test them as gold is tested. Now, the way that it should read is this way: refine them as one refines silver, and test them as one tests gold. That would be the better way of translating. Now, the final part here is that this is not they. This is actually he or it. And this refers to the gold. The gold or the silver. Remember, it's metaphorical. The remnant third part is like silver and gold. So he will call on my name and I will respond to them. And God will say, God will say, and this is not they. Let me just strike this off. This is he or it, right? This is the gold or silver. They are my people. And of course, this word here should also be struck off. It will be he or it will say, Jehovah is my God. Now, what are we reading here is that the people, or I will call them the remnant faithful, who did not die in the ordeal, this will give us the end of purification. And that's how chapter 13 is described. We have some challenges in the translation, but nevertheless, it is in a poetic way describing sometime in the future. There is a lot of destruction. There will be a cleansing of idols. There will be a cleansing of the prophets. There will be a cleansing of evil in the land. Those that is against God, God will remove them, as it is described. Arise, the knife or the sword to kill the what is described as my shepherd and my friendly warriors. These are the nations and the kings and the rulers who are placed to assist Israel, to take care of Israel. And it is a description that is a time when Israel has no king. And these will be the other nations that is subduing Israel, and they will hurt Israel, and God will then cleanse them from the land. And many people die. 2/3 of the people in the land die. A third will be put through the test and refined. And that is what it means to go through the fire, go through the ordeal, and then they will call on God's name. So this word they, although it's translated they, this is referring to the gold or the silver that is being tested and refined. And God says, that gold and silver, that's my people. And the gold and silver will say, Jehovah is my God. Notice this is in the singular, and it is correct because it will be it. Otherwise, it will be our God. So the Lord or Jehovah is my God. And with this, the prophecy of purification will be over in chapter 13. And with this, we come to the end of our session today.